how's it going? Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me once again for Trad Queen Story Hour. Tonight, I have the inestimable Wilfred X. Reilly. This says, Californian. Wilfred, you're not actually in California, right?
No, that was a joke. I basically, when California announced, or at least SF announced that they'd give $5 million to any black person that could show California residency. I mean, I was in the nightlife business for quite a while back in the day. I've had apartments in different parts of the country. I became convinced I might be able to do that, and I'm certainly black. So I wanted to shout out to California, giving me that completely unearned pile of money, despite my being a successful author who's half Caucasian. So just wanted to appreciate what they were doing out there. So I'm Wilfred X. Reilly, Californian right now. If they turn down my reparations application once the program begins, I will reject them once again. But
that's great. I love it. That's awesome. I love the spirit that you tackle that with. The whole San Francisco thing was so silly to me. I was like, there is no freaking way they're going to be able to afford any of this. Imagine this much money going to any one person from a state that never had slavery. Just crazy to me. But Wilfred, what have you been up to recently besides changing your title to say you're a Californian?
Well, I've been doing a range of things. I mean, the most important thing I do is teach. I mean, I'm a professor at Kentucky State. So I have, like most state U profs, every semester I have, 2 to 5 classes, and I shape the minds of the next generation. I teach quantitative methods. I teach constitutional law. This semester I'm teaching a class in congressional leadership. It's a bit dry, but it's interesting material, and Congress has given us a lot to work with. So that's one of the things that I do. I also have written another book. It looks like the title is going to be Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. But I saw basically every one of my books looks at kind of an open spot in the knowledge industry, maybe, but like Hate Crime Hoax was based around the idea that there were pretty obviously, if you just went on to Reddit or you went on to Quora or something like that, all these very high profile racial incidents of Covington Catholic, Jussie Smollett, that had turned out not to be real. But if you looked at the published sort of criminal justice literature, the claim was that there were about 20 hate crime hoaxes a year. And my assumption was that they were using a legitimate but really narrow definition. So I used a slightly broader, but again, legitimate one. And I found over a period of about 5 years, 400 really prominent incidents of this sort of hoaxing, this kind of BSing. Yasmin Saweed, Bubba Wallace. I mean, many of these college campus nooses that were reported as hate crimes, so on. The next book, Taboo, looked at kind of 10 of the most prominent things that were being discussed in the news media, like police near genocide against black men, quote unquote. And I was able to test whether or not these were actually real using modern quantitative methods. Shout to Heather McDonald and other people that did similar work there. But I mean, what I found was that much of that stuff, much of what the average, maybe upper middle class American believed was complete BS, frankly. I don't know if we can curse on the program for trying to go live on YouTube. Our big tech overlords dislike it. But I mean, like the average liberal believes that between 1,000 and 10,000 unarmed black men are killed by the cops every year. It's like 7. Like the last 2 years, it was 6 and 11, I believe. I'm not researching this anymore, so my numbers might be off by like 2. But I mean, so I wrote that book. And this one is a response to that whole genre of books that came out in the 70s and 80s that critiqued kind of the jingoistic pro-American education we really did have for a while, but had names like Lies My Teacher Told Me, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, so on. And my assumption reading textbooks as someone who's put together curricula a bunch of times for a college and who's also taught in high school is, well, the problem here is that these boys have been in power for the past 50 years. This is the problem with woke stuff in general, by the way. Like, we won the civil rights movement. Like, blacks and Asians don't have been equal for 6 decades. And now how are we doing? Like, it's fair to ask that. So I looked at modern curricula, modern textbooks, and kind of asked, and it sounds dry, but it's really not. I kind of asked, is what we're telling kids these days about, say, gender or about Native Americans, about slavery, is it communism, is it any more honest than what we used to say? And the answer is just obviously not. Like, one chapter is called Native Americans Weren't Peaceful. And I'm part Native. Nice. I have mad love for my Native ancestors. They're the greatest warriors in history. They just found a stadium full of skulls in the Aztec lands in Mexico. So, I mean, when people talk about, the brutal conquerors destroyed the pacifistic Aztecs and Mayas, and no, they won the war. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just so the modern narrative, I think, kind of getting to the point, is no more honest than the traditional one. So I talk about why, and I also talk about why there's no criticism of the modern narrative. Why, after 60
Mm.
years of affirmative action, we're still talking about racism. And I make the point that it's obvious that this is really decades behind the game, that we can talk about the modern problems we have today in the other direction.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I'm really grateful that you're writing about this stuff because that's kind of the thing that I see nobody really covering. I wanted to ask you, what role do you think that Americans' complete ignorance of history plays in this? Because I feel that often. I'm like, people don't seem to understand that history, the entirety of history, is completely full of people doing insanely brutal, horrible things to other people and other groups of people. That's the way it's always been. The way we live right now is an insane anomaly. And I think that if people were better educated in history, they might be a little more understanding of the context we live in now. What do you think?
No, I mean, I think it's just obviously accurate. Like, so there are a couple different levels to this. I read recently, and again, people can dig up the source. I don't have the source in front of me, but if I recall correctly, about 40% of American school children think only the USA ever had slaves.
Right.
And I've
Yeah.
encountered things like this myself. Like, I was watching one of the Robin Hood movies with a young mentee, like, recently. Great guy, kid named Monte. And he said something like they were hanging a white guy for, outlawry, like cattle theft or whatever. And he said, that's unrealistic. I mean, they're lynching that guy. And it was like, well, you have to go into this whole thing, like hanging was what they did, because they didn't have courts and everywhere until, 100 years ago. Lynching was just a brutal version of it. Yeah, they hung white guys, and 2,000 people that were lynched were white. So yeah, I think people absolutely don't know this kind of thing. And it creates a false narrative in that people believe not that the USA was brutal and violent when everyone was brutal and violent, but that there was something uniquely evil about Americans or whites or whatever. And that's completely false. Like, researching the upcoming book, Lies, my liberal teacher told me to do another blatant plug, available on Amazon right now. But
Yes, do it.
pre-sales are going really well. But I mean, but researching that book, I found out that one of the first written human words was slave. So, like, the image is, it was Sumerian. It's like man and mountain, because the people that fought the great Sumerian city-states were the warrior tribes from the mountains. So, like, the word for slave is like man, mountain, and shackle. Like, it's a mountain warrior with chains all around him, standing there looking miserable, like in graphic form. So the idea that you take your defeated enemies and you make them work, I mean, that's what blacks did to whites, or blacks broadly defined, but Moors, Moroccans, that's what galley slavery was. That's what whites did to blacks. They bought defeated Bantu warriors across the slave and pepper coasts. It's what blacks did to each other. It's what whites did to each other, often under more pleasant names like chattel serfdom, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, I think the fact that people don't know this about the entire sweep of history makes it easier to call our society uniquely bad. And one more thing there, I think people don't understand, you just said this really well, I don't think people understand how recent civilization is.
Yeah.
So,
right.
like, I definitely don't define myself as a male feminist because I'm not a creep. But I mean, like, I was recently looking up basic women's rights stuff because, I mean, everyone's pretty first wave. Like, women should be able to vote, drive, and so on.
Right.
But I mean, like, women weren't able to get checking accounts without a man in the USA until 1973. By the way, the same year, not to be like crude or glib, but like Miss Magazine ran a poll asking couples about their sex life, and under 20% of men knew what a clitoris was. Like, just basically no idea. Just like
old school. Yeah.
Yeah, legitimately old school. Like, that's dirty.
Yeah.
I don't move the face down there. But it's just like the idea of just normal things, like adults, intimacy, going to the bank together, all that stuff, that didn't exist, 50 years ago? So, I mean, like, black people, at least in the South, this absolutely wasn't the case in the North, but black people endured segregation until 1954. The right of conquest internationally, because again, these weren't just American problems, existed until about the same year. So, like, when people say, well, we used to conquer things, that wasn't like a used to, like Hitler was conquering things in the 1940s. We banned conquest under international law, again, within the lifetime of someone's dad. So the lack of understanding that this stretched across the Germans, the black community, the rest of the USA, so on. Yeah, that really cripples people's understanding of what life was like. We didn't have computers. I mean, you could just go on and on.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the other thing too is that we don't realize how much we have. Like
Oh, yeah.
literally, just at a very material level, we don't understand that we live better than any monarch has ever lived in history. We have indoor plumbing, we have heating, we have technology, we have food whenever we want it, wherever we want it. We have basic rights, and yes, it's incredibly flawed, a lot of it. I wanted to ask you, because you were talking about the situation of modern African Americans. What role do you think that the welfare state played in that? Because I really enjoy what Thomas Sowell has to say about that, and I think he's pretty much dead on. Do you blame the welfare state for a lot of the current situation, or do you think that there's something else I haven't considered?
Yeah, no, I pretty much, I think that contemporary racism has almost nothing to do with problems in the contemporary black community. That's not to say there aren't more poor black people than poor whites on average because of past racism and ethnic conflict. I mean, it would be glib but accurate to say, well, we lost the war. I mean, that obviously had an impact. Native Americans the same. And poor white Appalachians as well, by the way. I mean, the South, after, white bond servitude and then the Civil War, had a lot of problems that the North didn't. That for obvious reasons of sympathy, there's less of it. We don't talk about. But I mean, so like one thing, and to respond to the first thing you said, when you say like we live better than any monarch ever, first, I don't know if that's true in just like amoral, predatory terms. Like, I mean, when you listen to like the things the Roman emperors said, like bring me a pound of opium and an elephant. Like, I mean, I do think there was an ability to hold like massive wine-drenched orgies for weeks that I'm a little old for now, but that most people would probably do for at least a while if you were an ancient king. And
right. That's fair.
Yeah, but I mean, but the point itself is really valid. I was watching, I think it was Netflix Dracula recently. And just like an old episode, and Dracula, at one point is like in the hood in England. He's just in a council estate, like crappy building. And he's telling the person that lives there how wealthy she is. And she's like, what are you talking about, mate? And no, I'm not. And he says, well, of all the kings and emperors I've sparred with and eaten and, talked with and played chess with, none of them had these things, the moving chariot you have outside and the screen with the talking pictures that's 60 inches wide, and, and the acre of lawn in front and so on. And by the end of it, she's seeing things a bit differently. So, yeah, we do tend to kind of disrespect the happy lives almost everyone has now. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. So, go on.
Sorry. The welfare state thing, though, just very briefly, like, the problems that you see now in the black community, by the way, also in working class white communities, like more than half the kids don't have a dad and so on. Those, one, didn't exist when racism was much worse. So like in 1938, Walter Williams looked at the black family and found out that the illegitimacy rate was 11%. Now, whites are doing even better. It was like 4%. Good job, countrymen. But it wasn't a problem for anybody. Two, these problems don't exist for minority immigrant groups today. There absolutely is not a 70% or even a 10% illegitimacy rate, out of wedlock birth rate, if you prefer, in the Nigerian community or most Asian communities. So, I mean, there's no way to claim that's due to active racism today. And third, again, if you look at Appalachians or other working poor white people, you see the exact same problems. Like they kind of sub in suicide for homicide or ODs for gang violence or something. But other than that, like out of wedlock birth, gangbanging itself, car wreck, like all that stuff is identical. So you can't look at a black guy and a white guy that have the same problems that are working in the same factory and separate out the black guy and say, well, the problem he's facing is due to racism. It doesn't make any sense.
Right. Well, I tend to flex that in the opposite direction. I listen to people who are white nationalists, for lack of a better word, and I'm like, no, this is so clearly a cultural issue that you are not examining here. Because when you look at immigrant groups, these are people who have the same amount of melanin, sometimes more, and they have extremely tight-knit families. They have extremely high levels of this interest in living the American dream and working their tails off. You see it with Asian people as well, to a significant degree. But since most of the white national / white supremacist ire is focused at African American communities, you just have to say, nah, you're just wrong. This is just a cultural issue. on this kind of topic, you wrote an article for commentary that I didn't have a chance to read the whole thing. And you are bringing up a super cool silver lining, because we're all about silver linings over here. Your tweet says, after several requests, I'm creating a thread of my major recent articles. This is probably the most widely shared so far. I break down the actual data surrounding racism and racial group performance in the modern USA. And your title is "The Good News They Won't Tell You About Race in America." So how would you recap the good news? It sounds like some of the stuff we've been talking about so far.
Yeah, it's a lot of the stuff we've been talking about so far. I mean, the first point is just the first element of the good news is just the first thing that I said when I was talking about, the book that's coming out. One of the things that's almost never discussed is that the civil rights movement has been over for decades and the good guys won. So, I mean, again, 1954, desegregation, 1964, racism became virtually illegal. I mean, racial discrimination is civilly and often criminally illegal per the Civil Rights Act. We're one of the few countries in the world where that's true. I mean, since 1967, we've had pro-minority affirmative action. So, I mean, one of the most disadvantaged groups in the country is actually poor white boys. And I don't say that out of fake sympathy. I mean, that was a lot of my friends in high school. I mean, so it's, if you're an Italian or Greek kid or something like that, and you want to go to a Big Ten or Ivy University, I mean, you better join the Marines, son.
Yeah.
So that is my basic thesis, is that those things worked. Like, it's just bizarre to believe, looking at kind of striving Asians or members of the black middle class, Jews, Cubans, whatever, that 60 years of advantage for those guys. I don't know if Jewish Americans will always benefit or whatever, but I mean, the basic point's obvious. 60 years of advantage for those guys didn't have some effect. So if you look at, first of all, if you look at American society overall, you see obvious changes in group performance. Like, one of the most recent presidents was black. But more to the point, and this is point 2 of the article, if you actually do the kind of quantitative analysis that I, or for that matter, probably you could do, you see that the gaps that are glibly attributed to racism or sometimes to genetics by the hard right between groups just sort of vanish. And I mean, with blacks and whites, it's amazing the extent to which this is true. Like, if you adjust for basically 3 things like age, region, and test scores, almost all of the black-white gaps just vanish. I mean, and by the way, this is true for men and women as well. Right. I don't want to go down like a whole rabbit hole here, but we were talking about feminism, like the feminist claim is, we women even today earn 59 cents to the man's dollar. You can't call that fair. And that's just one of the most ridiculous fake statistics in the game. I mean, the 59-cent version of that is based on comparing all men and all women, despite the fact that like a third of women are fairly happy housewives. It's just totally made up.
Right. And that one, I think that the wage gap is probably the best statistic or the best argument they use that you could point to and just be like, hey, if they're using this argument when it comes to men and women, imagine how they're using it when it comes to race. Like, you really need to think about it. They obviously think this works. A lot of people are persuaded by this. So what do you think? Why do you think we are so unable to grapple with our own success in this front?
Great question.
Because you're right. Like, we're winning, we're making progress, but on the topic of progress, is this just a progressive thing where we can't stop? We're just going to keep moving toward this ephemeral goal that is not really established?
Well, I think that's a big part of it. I think there are 2 parts of it. One, I didn't even really think about until you kind of broke it down. But I think the other is more obvious. The other is what a lot of people with sort of business backgrounds, including me, recognize. There's an entire industry of people that have a vested interest in not making progress. I mean, everyone from Tom Sowell to Tucker Carlson, everyone on the right has pointed this out. I mean, so when you look at the massive block of people from organizations that do some good that I've given to, from like the NAACP, they'll sometimes file lawsuits against residual actual racism when they find it. But I mean, on to just pure activist groups, whatever Al Sharpton is, the National Action Network, the Black Lives Matter chapters that took in, never say stole $11.6 billion recently. Sean King. I mean, this entire, you're now seeing some of these clowns in Tennessee. I mean, that guy, Pearson, who used to be a popular theater kid running for president of Bowdoin, who's now dressing up like Malcolm X and screaming Yeah, then I think then I moved into more straight up criticism and said, well, I mean, there's also, you know, whatever Reverend Al is right now, the National Action Network, and then you go into the mini Black Lives Matter chapters that together collectively took in, you know, Never Say stole 11.6 billion over the last fundraising cycle. That's a real figure from The Economist. You know, so on down the line, Sean King, whatever group he's associated with, Patrice Cullors. You've got these clowns in Tennessee right now, like Justin Pearson, who,
Yes.
yeah, who's a like well-off preppy theater kid who's currently dressing up as Malcolm X and doing a substantial amount of fundraising. He'll be on the Harvard campus with David Hogg in 2 days.
Oh
So all of
gosh.
these people, the thing that gives them a podium, the things that gives them a bully pulpit, is the claim that there is massive systemic bias throughout society. So when I say that, for example, the average leftist believes that between 1,000 and 10,000 unarmed black men are killed annually by the police, that's not just a figure I'm pulling out of thin air, to put it politely. I mean, it's a well-known research conclusion from the Skeptic Research Center, and they asked thousands of people. And the reason people believe this is that people keep saying it. I mean, what's his name? Ben Crump, that lawyer who
Oh
shows up every time someone
gosh.
gets shot by the cops. But I mean, you know, you might think he's a clown, but probably America's leading attorney. He wrote a
Smart.
yeah, it's crazy to hear, but he wrote a
Yeah.
book called Open Season: The Legalized Genocide of Colored People, and I believe, I don't want to misquote him, but his estimate of, you know, police and vigilante murders or whatever the language was 10,000 or something like that. I mean, Chernobyl, and that might be total caused by, you know, jail deaths or something. But I mean, like Chernobyl, a Black Lives Matter activist, just openly went on primetime Fox, and he very specifically said, like, every day, totally innocent, presumably unarmed black man is murdered by the police. It was every 24 or 28 hours. So I mean, that would just be a blunt figure of close to 365 a year. So people just kept saying this over and over. And again, the Crump estimate might be a little high. I encourage people to check out his book. Everything he says is crazy, but it's a good summary of the left wing perspective on this. But I mean, so if you are saying that there are thousands of innocent brothers being murdered by cops, and you're raising tens of millions of dollars as a result of your doing this, the odds of your genuinely wanting race relations to get better or something like that are pretty slim. So that's the first element. Like, there's a massive, almost industrial complex, to use the famous term here, of people that are in this civil rights zone. You also see this with crazy things like homelessness, by the way. Like, it's so hard to get the homeless off the streets because there are all these organizations out there advocating for them. I mean, there are 10-story buildings in San Francisco full primarily of these folks. And there are campaigns like, this year we're going to get them porta potties, this year we're going to get them generators. The basic idea of getting them off the street into compassionate, like, mental health care or even jails is not discussed, because then you don't have a job. So that's point one. I think the other thing, though, what you said deserves some merit, some discussion, because your point was that, like, even if this one thing stops, the whole point of progressivism is kind of like constantly queering and challenging the boundaries, because you're such an edgy, feminist, artsy, you know, college grad student type. You need to publish. So even if the race stuff fell by the wayside, we wouldn't see an end to this. You would just see the next mascot group, if that makes sense. So,
That
like,
makes
that's
perfect sense.
yeah, like that's what you're seeing with the gender stuff to some extent. Like, it sounds like you had something to kind of put in there.
Yeah, I want to let you finish your thought, but I do have a thought on this point.
Yeah, but I mean, like, there are a tiny number of people that actually do have real gender dysphoria. Like, I've read Deborah So, you know, Helen Joyce, and the response papers to them, and so on, Abigail Schreier. There's like a serious debate going on about this. But I mean, this used to be 0.4% or something like this, the population, maybe a little less. And there's probably an overlap there with actually intersex people. But I mean, like, right now, you've seen this massive, like, 1,000% increase in people claiming this. Like, 20% of kids now claim they're LGBT in some way, and, you know, 4% claim that they are trans or other just made up things, basically, like non-binary demisexuals. And it's impossible not to see that as, like, the classic contagion you see in school. It's impossible not to see that as the result of gender theory being in the schools and all over YouTube and so on. So I mean, this is kind of the next campaign. People who are so caring and so woke are now seizing on this and moving. Race has become almost cliche. The next thing is, are you brave enough to defend our trans kids? And when we move
Hmm.
on from that, I mean, there are an endless number of other mascot groups. Like, will transracial people be taken seriously? What about other kin, the roughly million people that claim there's something other than human? You know, what about pedophiles? Like, I don't want to compare that to just the normal LGBT community, but it's an obvious next outlier group. They have a flag. So we'll see, but there's not an inherent stopping point for progressivism the way there is for conservatism or even classical liberalism, because the whole point is going forward.
Yes, exactly. And it's so interesting to me that conservatives have this reputation for standing athwart history yelling stop. And it's like, yes, that's exactly what they're doing, because they can see that history is simply progressing toward something that's not nailed down. Like, we don't know what it is. We're just moving toward it. And we suspect, my parents suspected in the 90s, and I was like, yeah, whatever, you guys are old fuddy-duddies. Now I'm like, nope, they were right. Everything they were saying has come to pass. And yes, a lot of conservatives believe that the next frontier is going to be trans ageism, which is where, you know, love has no age, et cetera, et cetera. And I can't help but think that's what we're seeing with, you know, Drag Queen Story Hour and some of this other stuff that they're really trying to teach to really young kids. And we have teachers or other brilliant, high-minded academics telling us that kids can know that they're trans before they're born. Crazy, crazy ideas. And it's just like, man, I don't know. It seems like you guys are going in a really bad direction. The thing that I noticed, the interesting factor, the crossover between what's happening to young kids now and what's happening with progressivism, is that where there is incentive, monetary incentive to keep something going, like, for example, trying to gender affirm young children, what they're finding is that this is a great way to make money for the entire lifetime of this child. Because once you go through with a gender affirming surgery or start them on cross-sex hormones, what you find is that then they have to return for more and more and more care.
Yep.
Deeply depressing to me, but I can see the monetary incentive, just like we see with Benjamin Crump, just like we see with Ibram Kendi, fundraising off all this stuff. Where there's money, they're going to keep pushing it. So how do we kind of get in the way of that? Is there any way to stop that?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a bunch of stuff there. I mean, the first thing, the trans kids thing, strikes me as evil or on the verge of it. I mean, if you've ever actually read any of the stuff about gender confusion in kids, it mostly happens because kids are gay. So there really are, I mean, like, you know, I was an athlete, although not an extraordinarily good one in high school, you know, like there really are set gender roles. Like, you know, hey, bro, you tough enough to sit in this section of the bus? And if you
Yeah.
don't fit in as a boy or a girl, there can be some confusion about that. And like, I mean, I was reasonably good at sports, but I'm also a big nerd. I write and so on. So I had some of these thoughts. I didn't think I was a girl, but it was kind of like, you know, am I going to be geeky forever for a little bit? And then I started dating and I found out girls actually like people that can talk to them, you know.
Right.
And so it was kind of like, okay, I mean, I seem at least as male in this respect as a lot of my boys, and kind of just went on with life. But those kind of confusions that happen, they're very, very common. And if you're a gay kid and you're 12 or 13, I mean, you don't know anything about anal sex at that time if you've been properly raised, you know.
Right.
You don't know necessarily that you're gay. You have these odd feelings toward boys. You feel a little less toward girls. Many people are naturally bisexual than most people. You're perhaps a bit more feminine. So a lot of people deal with that. The reality, though, is that people have studied this, and between 69 and 91%, if I have the figures correctly, of kids that deal with gender confusion just go on to be gay or to be heterosexual female jocks or something like that. So to
Right.
take these confused kids and show them this organized propaganda, like, this is Jindy, the gender unicorn, and this is why you feel the way you do. I mean, grooming is not an over-the-top label for that. Like, that's extremely bizarre behavior for an organized group of adult teachers. And the reason that it's so bizarre is that there actually is a set of treatments for hard body adult gender dysphoria that may even be appropriate for hard body adult gender dysphoria. I'm not a doctor, but they're very medicalized. Like, we're going to put you on these hormones, and if that doesn't affect sufficient change in your body, we're going to do things like cut off your penis. So you're now treating kids that have this temporary confusion in this same way. Like, well, let's put you on the treatment ladder. What's on the treatment ladder? Well, we're going to cut off your dick, Johnny. I mean, so it's just, that's not good. And it's just so obviously not good that I think almost everyone can see it. There's just a massive social taboo right now against pointing this out. By the way, your point about conservatism, which is pretty deep, like standing athwart history and so on, like the famous comment from, I think, Talleyrand that National Review uses.
Yeah.
The point is that that's a good thing to do. In society, I would argue that you need a few liberals and even a few radicals, but you need a bunch of backbone holding conservatives because most mutations are bad. This is a point even in biological science. Like, most new things that people propose are bad, stupid ideas. And that needs to be recognized to some extent. So, like, when people look at the 1960s, there's this tendency to kind of glamorize the era. Like, that was civil rights, so on down the line, Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy. Who could oppose that? But the reality is that almost everything that came out of the 1960s, speaking as a businessman on the right or the center right, was bad. Like the anti-nuke movement, the later waves of feminism, the craziest stuff in the sexual revolution. I do like the fact most people now know what a clitoris is. I imagine women don't. I can't speak for them. But I mean, like the fourth wave of feminism, the rest of that, like the drug movement, all these whole cities smell like weed now, syringes all over the ground. We lost the Vietnam War because of the massive campaign against it. 5 million people, was it, died. Like, all of this stuff was terrible. The race riots that destroyed whole cities, some of them came pretty close to ethnic cleansing. They're now written out of history. It was unprovoked white flight, the narrative goes. And all of these things came out of the left-wing movement at the time. They weren't coincidences. People who had been leaders of, for example, the Weathermen wrote books about them. So I think opposing that kind of thing is a very good thing, and there are major consequences if you're not successful. So, yeah, important point. What can we do in the future about the gender stuff and so on? Oppose it. And I think, again, the advantage of the right is what Nixon and I believe even Kennedy famously called the power of the silent majority. Most people know that it's crazy to say that, for example, some women have 9-inch penises. So when you say that, there's an enormous reserve of power that you draw on. You might feel like you're alone, but you're not. And I think that that's basically it. Like, this has really been illustrated to me, kind of like last sentence, but I do a lot of polling, sometimes for actual clients, but sometimes just on social media, SurveyMonkey, that kind of thing. And whenever I do this, I'm almost stunned by the results. Because, like, I have a pretty bro audience, but it also has, like, everyone's feminist girlfriend in it. It's like 100,000 strong. And, like, yesterday I asked, should males compete in women's athletics? Just like a trimmed down version of the trans question. And the response, and this was RT'd like a bunch of times by feminist accounts on both sides of the question, the response was 97% no and 3% yes. And
Wow.
and that's because of the way it was phrased, I believe. It wasn't like, should trans girls compete with their proper preferred gender or something? It was just, should men be in women's sports? Which is, at root, without brutality, the question. And so I think that advantage is the simple reality that most people instinctively respond by saying hell no to that. So that's the advantage of being in the saddle of history yelling no.
Yes, I love that. And I do appreciate that. And I think there's going to be ramping up resistance from the feminist left against this stuff. And they'll call them TERFs and they'll call them names and they will attack them. It's very interesting to watch it happening because there's a lot of pent up aggression coming from these activists for some reason. I wanted to circle back a little bit because this was a really interesting thing that you shared that I want to tie back to this misconception about how many people are targeted by police, commonly espoused by people like Benjamin Crump. Now, you tweeted, depressing data from a quick glance at the paper, it looks like the cuts were far more common on the POC side, and this was in reference to an article that was summarized by saying, ditching a friend who is not like you can deepen social inequality. And it's talking about defriending during Trump's campaign and election, showing diverse relationships were hardest hit. And I was thinking about this for about 5 minutes before we started. And I was thinking, how much can we push an idea like white supremacy is everywhere and not see a negative impact on relationships, interpersonal relationships on the personal level? That's soul crushing to see. it just makes sense to me. I don't know if you disagree with me on that count, but I think that's exactly where it's coming from. The media has this power to change people's minds.
No, I don't disagree with you at all. And that's something that you're seeing more and more lately. I mean, there was an article that ran in the Washington Post feature piece that was titled something like, "Can I Have White Friends?" And as I
Right.
recall, the author's conclusion was no. And I mean, you're seeing stuff like this on the left and on the right now in response. I think the right stuff is pretty much totally reactionary. But like
Right.
Robin DiAngelo recently said, she was talking to an audience of, diversity trainers and the like. And her comment was, I think you need to spend a lot of time away from white people, given the level of danger in society. And either a week before or a week after, I mean, whatever. But I mean, Scott Adams, the Dilbert guy,
Yeah.
said exactly, like
I
word for
know.
word, the
I
same
know.
thing. Like, this data, he was reading a Pew Rasmussen poll. This data indicates that a large number of black people won't agree with the basic statement, it's okay to be white. You need to get the hell away from black people. Now, I would agree that, I mean, I would argue that at least Adams basically just misread a lot of that. I mean, there's an effect where when you show people these sort of slogans from the fighting a couple of years back, no matter how banal they
Right.
seem, like all lives matter, people are like, no, I saw that on the banner, I'm not agreeing with that. Like Black Lives Matter only has something like a 52% approval rate, I think. So I mean that I think this is the same thing here. Like it's okay to be white was very famously a 4chan slogan. Anyone
Right.
who's taking a computerized poll probably knows that. But anyway, leaving aside whether he's right or he's wrong, it's notable that one of the more famous kind of center right figures and maybe the most famous kind of lefty feminist type said the same thing within 2 weeks of each other. So yeah, of
Yeah.
course, like if you keep presenting this narrative of we're almost at war with each other, there's constant ethnic conflict, it's ongoing. Yeah, I mean it's going to be very difficult for you to have a friend who's on what a Bosnian would call the Chetnik side, the enemy side.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
not to beat this horse again, but the problem with this in America is that we're not at war. I mean, this is my most recent article for Newsweek. That I mean, one of the phenomenal, or in the sense of remarkable things about all this is that in a time period when only it's like 6% of whites, 10% of blacks test as bigots in the sense of wouldn't engage in interracial marriage, almost everyone thinks race relations are bad. Like the figure for thinks they're bad, I don't want to just keep dropping specific numbers, but it's dropped by about half since
Right.
2000, since that Jordan and Bird era. It's gone down by almost 50% among both of the major ethnic groups. I guess Latinos weren't in that poll, but there's no reason for it to have. Like actual interracial marriages, integrated military units, neighborhoods, everything is up. People are just mad because we keep having this nonsense pumped into our veins by the media.
100%. I think that's entirely correct. Well, along those lines, I really want to ask you if you think that we are facing some kind of civil conflict, because that was something we talked about a lot at Timcast IRL. And I just found myself full on disagreeing with it like 90% of the time. I don't even think the genders are at war. Like being in a happy, strong marriage, I'm like, no, we need each other. And the more people are getting dissatisfied with the dating pool, the more it's like, oh, yeah, no, we're not at war with each other. We need good, strong men. We need happy, content women. We need to be there for each other and support each other strongly, because if we don't, we fail, period. And I think the same can be said for the whole racial thing. I think it's so overblown, and I'm optimistic that people are starting to notice it. But do you see any potential for civil conflict down the road?
No, not really. I mean, so like the gender thing, first of all, I mean, there's not going to be any war there. I mean, there's a famous old
Right.
line from one of the American generals, like, you'll never have a war between the sexes because there's too much fraternization with the enemy.
Indeed,
And I mean,
yes.
yeah, like, I mean, most people that are married or in loving, gonna be a marriage relationships, like not having sex or cooking together for a week would be a real strain. And you'd see the army starting to melt away and go back
Right.
home. I mean, that's not a thing that's going to happen. I mean, people did joke about the incel thought war on the internet. Like there were all these men and women that were in these non-relationship situations at the two extremes. And there was genuine hate between those two camps. But I mean, first of all, they're not armed. I mean, at least in the
Right.
sense of organized forces. And two, the solution to the incel thought war would be them marrying each other. honestly.
Yeah,
I mean, like
basically.
the solution to being a guy with a decent job who's not getting laid on the one hand, and two, a woman who keeps getting played by broke, useless men would be for the two of them to go on 30 dates. I mean, like it's
Right.
really there's an established protocol for how to handle this. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for these young guns that haven't figured that out, but that is the solution for the gentleman in the audience. And I ask her
Yeah.
out politely, pick a steakhouse. Anyway, so that having solved that problem, the racial and political conflict thesis I think is a little more serious. But I mean, again, I'm a pretty prolific writer, and I looked at this for I think National Review after Marjorie Taylor Greene said, you know, there's a civil war coming, or we need a
Right.
national divorce. I think would be more accurate, more specific as a way of putting that. And the idea was just totally implausible. Like Marjorie Taylor Greene lives in a blue state. I mean, two of the largest groups in Georgia are black Democrats and white Democratic union workers. Like when the state goes red, it does by 1 percentage point. So the
Right.
idea that she's going to break her state away from the union is utterly implausible. Like the state has two Democratic representatives. And there were just problems like that throughout the whole idea. Like if you separated the country by blue states and red states, almost all of the black population and all of the neo-Confederate population would be together in the red country,
Oh boy.
which would also which would also have most of the border with Mexico because of Texas.
Wow.
So like all of the
Right.
groups that are currently fighting each other would be in the same country. Like it was there were just these actual structural issues once you start talking about this kind of thing. So like if they all somehow got together long enough to fight the USA and break away, then their third world country would immediately break into black, redneck, and Mexican third world countries. I mean, it's not a thing that's going to happen. And this also assumes that the actual commanding general of the armies wouldn't just shove Biden to the ground, point a nuke at Amarillo, and say like, "This is over." I mean, like,
Right.
shut up. I've had enough. You know,
Yeah.
so that is not a thing that's going to happen. I do think that there are things that could destabilize America to the point where you see South Africa, you know, Irania style balkanization, where
Yeah.
one state would be all Caucasian, middle class, and heavily armed. Another state would be 70% black, working middle class, and heavily armed. It would be hard to travel. That could be 50 years down the road if we don't work on immigration, if we keep sending out these idiotic messages via the media, via the schools. So that's a possibility. Not the country collapsing, but the kind of situation you've seen in Lebanon, Britain, and Ireland, like pretty Israel, Palestine, like big civilized countries. Like that could happen. And hopefully it
Yeah.
won't.
So yeah, 100%. I think so too. Well, my hopeful outcome is that we all naturally sort into places like either California or Florida. I saw a tweet that is, I think, completely not based in reality, talking about Florida's housing market crashing after they passed this restrictive abortion ban. And I was like, no freaking way. BS. Don't give me hope. That's not happening. Florida is still an incredibly desirable place to move. And pretty
Don't give
much
me hope.
nothing's going to change that, right? Um, I mean, besides the usual hurricanes, crocodile, or alligators, snakes and stuff like that. But those are just risks that come with living in Florida. I was thinking about that today, and I was like, red-blooded Americans, people who vote red, are going to go to Florida because that's where their politicians agree with those beliefs, right? Whereas it's interesting because it's not true the other way around. Like Gavin Newsom has left California to go to other states and poke at them, right? He went to Florida and he's like, this is what they're doing here. Imagine what it's going to be like if it's like a nationwide thing. And it's interesting because people are fleeing California. So interesting. Over 500,000 people left, I think, in 2019. And I'm sure that number has not decreased over the past 3 years. And it's interesting to see people want to leave these states. So I'm like, how does this shake out? People want to leave these blue states. They want to go to these red states. But then when these people leave the blue states and go to the red states, like I saw in Colorado firsthand, they vote for blue policies. And then they're like, oh, why does this state look like California now? So strange to me. I wish I had a solution, but it feels like people are just going to end up where they're feeling more politically comfortable. Do you think that's also like a happy middle ground outcome that we could possibly see? Or are the California voters and the New Yorkers going to come down to Florida and vote to change their policies?
Yeah, I think that you'll see in most cases, I think the sorting will work. I mean, I don't think you'll see a lot of people move to North Dakota that want North Dakota to look like California.
Right.
I think you'll see a lot of people fleeing California to North Dakota specifically because they're tired of how California looks. And I also think you'll see, it'll probably be only 80% as many, but I mean, I think you'll see a lot of North Dakota kids, for that matter, from mid-sized cities like Fargo moving to LA to, try their chops at acting or whatever. So, I mean, you see that all the time, and I think it'll intensify for the next maybe 15 years as we get a little more politically polarized. So basically, yeah, I think the red states will survive the blue state influx and stay pretty red. The only reason it's even worrisome is that the red states are smaller than the blue states, right? So like if most of the people that move to Tennessee from New York want Tennessee to look like Tennessee, but they swing Tennessee 5% in a blue direction, that's still pretty significant for a state the size of Tennessee. I mean,
Right.
so there's not really that much that can be done about that. I think that in general, the red states might get a bit less conservative, but will stay pretty red, I think. And the blue states might get a bit less liberal. In fact, that would be an ideal outcome for the sorting. Like people think of sorting, I guess, and I just thought this really, it's not something I've researched, but people think of sorting as making, say, Florida hard red. But in fact, the people coming to Florida are almost all coming from liberal states and are moderate conservatives.
Right.
I mean, the same thing for California. People think of it as making California hard blue. But the people that are going there to try out as actors and so on are actually coming mostly from the North Dakotas and so on. So if anything, you're probably going to see patterns that are pretty similar to those we have now. I mean, we'll see, but there doesn't seem to be much to be terrified about there. I don't really know what the future will look like.
Yeah, so it really does feel like all of this is ramped up, and we're going to start trying to wrap up here. But do you think that in order to downgrade all of our panic over all of these different things and all of these deep fractures we think we're seeing, which are probably mostly in our minds, do you think we need an overhaul of the mainstream media? Do you think that would help?
I'd love it. I mean, if I were president or king, I would fire everyone at most of the major broadcast outlets. I'd keep a few of them around I'd keep quite a few people around at Fox just because I know them. But I mean,
Right.
right of that, I'd make some changes too. And I mean, on the mainstream left wing outlets, MSNBC, I'd get rid of everybody. But I mean, also just like, NPR, it keeps some people around to talk about cats and the love lives of insects. But
Right.
I mean, it's like the major political programming in the USA, yeah, I think is extremely bad and it's been terrifying people. Now, obviously, I'm not going to be in a king-like position where I could do that. But in reality, I think what you can do at any kind of leadership level, one, you can counter the mainstream narrative by pointing out how false most of it is. You can encourage people to ignore it, to kind of go to the source if you're talking about scientific papers, and recognize that even a lot of those are biased to the left or to the right. So, I mean, that's one thing you can do. You can produce your own content, as you do quite well. You can encourage people to ignore some of the mainstream lines of content. Yeah, I don't, again, like as with the last question, I don't know if there's more to say beyond that. Like, yeah, I would drastically change the mainstream media if I could. I think what you can do is make the point that what you're being told is not reality. And I think that in this sense, the new media has done an invaluable good. Like right now, content creators like you and I and many of our friends gripe about Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. Like, yeah, they won't let you curse for 10 minutes uninterrupted and so on. Like there's all these
Yeah.
crazy words you can't say, like a traditional description of someone of transgender status. And, people prep
Correct.
themselves before shows and so on. But it's important to realize that until 15 years ago, there wasn't a Twitter or a Facebook or a YouTube. I mean, so like when I was growing up, and I'm just now like reaching the 40 mark, there were 10 channels. I mean, like older cousins tell me they remember when there were 3. So that at that point there was almost total control to the point where no one even noticed the bias. Like I remember older relatives talking about like the unbiased real news of, say, Walter Cronkite. And when you think about that, when you think about these players that slanted far enough to the left that they to some extent helped us lose the war in Vietnam, but who were seen as just universal dad figures, it's hard not to contrast that very negatively with what we have now. where you can go watch anything from the Young Turks to the Daily Wire, and that has far more of an audience pool than the average show on MSNBC. So, I mean, I guess, again, I'm going to keep putting out content, and I would encourage the average person who's interested in news to go listen to the Daily Wire, for that matter, the Young Turks, and turn off the TV. Like, it really is that simple. Like, this kind of dinosaur media doesn't really have that much to offer. And I think, just to get into one story that kind of illustrates that, actually, this is, I guess, kind of a fairly deep point. One of the things that people say a lot in the online content creator space is they're trying to censor me. Like, they're trying to censor conservatives or sex workers or whatever. Like, even like Anna Kaspari, and even like people on the true left are now saying this. They're trying to censor us too. The reality is that they're trying to censor all of us because that's the competition. Like, it's really, there's not a moral element to this at all. Like, the legacy media would like to annihilate the non-legacy media so it can go back to systemic dominance. And like, we just saw this at a crazy level. Like, I'm not defending this kid who's probably technically a traitor, but there was a massive national security leak, as you know, at least as well as I do, a couple days ago. And what was revealed was staggering. This was just on a Reddit gaming forum that I've known people to participate in. Like, this kid released these documents showing that Ukraine's losing the war. Like, all this crazy stuff. Like, they don't have missile defense systems. And like, we've been lying to our allies, and the Arab countries that we're allied with are spying on us. Now, that's not really a shock. We should have known that.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. But like, the other stuff was pretty staggering. And okay, so we caught the spy. Cool, whatever. He's an Air National Guardsman. That part doesn't really matter. Obviously, our government agencies should be trying to catch intel infiltrators, so on. What is striking is that the New York Times and the Washington Post seem to be the people that caught him. Like, they've been releasing the personal information, IP addresses, names of people in like these damn Reddit forums for days now. It's one of the most unethical things I've ever seen in journalism, as a matter of personal opinion. And the reason they're doing it, in my opinion, is the idea that there should be no leaks that don't involve them. Like, there are massive illegal leaks all the time. They leak Trump's taxes, but it's the idea is that it's cool if it's to the NYT. So there's this massive conflict between kind of the legacy media and everyone else that's producing content. And it's centered around this question of, are you a journalist? And I think the comeback to that from Ben Shapiro or Dan Bongino or Cenk Younger, for that matter, yourself, would be, are you a journalist, you hack? Like, you're running without revealing people's names. And I mean, like, there's not an inherent difference in quality or talent. There's just sort of an amoral struggle for market space. And it's important that people recognize that to some extent. So I think that's something that people can say about the traditional media that a lot of people don't know.
Yes. And that's actually a really great silver lining as we start to wrap this up, because you're correct. The parallel economy is very much alive and well when it comes to the alternative media. Like, we see this, we saw this with Timcast IRL. We see it with shows like Steven Crowder's. We look at all kinds of stuff the Daily Wire's doing. This is moving the right direction. Now, whether we get to the point where we're like convincing, in-laws and parents that NPR isn't really who they thought they were, and they are in fact state-sponsored media, remains to be seen. It might take a lot longer than we expected to or wanted to, but that's okay. We're on the right track. We're moving in the right direction. We have parallel economy moving forward. Dan Bongino has a payment processing system called Parallel Economy. We got places like Public Square where you can go find businesses who don't hate your guts. I'm sure you can find good beer over there now since Budweiser's gone crazy. Wilfred, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Where can people find you?
The simplest way to find me is to get on any internet search engine. We also could talk about Google results. But that's a different episode. And just search my name. It's WILFREDREILLY. You'll find my Facebook. Well, Twitter is probably what I should have led with.
Yeah.
But my more personal profiles, Facebook and all the ones with pictures of me and so on. You'll find my website. That's just a link from the university website, my books, my articles. So I'm pretty easy to get in touch with. And I'm still at that level of very moderate, quote unquote, fame where I'll engage with you and argue with you online. So just search me and look me up. I'll talk to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wilfred. Thank you for your time. We will see you next time. Until then. How's it going?